I'm going to invite Nate Allen with WaterStart up to join me, as well as Nicole Carter with the Congressional Research Service, and we'll kick off the first panel. Okay, well, our first panel of the day is titled "The Canary in the Coal Mine: Water as an Indicator for Climate Resilient Solutions." I was planning on doing a little bit of an opening to kind of frame out the issue and the relevance of climate resilience in the water sector, but I feel as though Sally did a wonderful job of that, so I'm not going to attempt to top that. So thank you for that, Sally. And that also allows us to stay on schedule, so that's great. First thing I want to do is introduce our two panel speakers. First, Nicole Carter with the Congressional Research Service. I've known Nicole for quite a few years as a former Hill staffer myself, and as a Hill staffer, when your boss asks you to look into an issue and you're kind of staring at a blank page and you don't know what to do, you pick up the phone or send an email to either Nicole or Congressional Research Service, and they're a wonderful organization, extremely bright people, and they've bailed me out of many jams, or at least situations where I need a lot of help. So Nicole performs research and analysis with the Congressional Research Service, primarily focusing on water resources. She has been there for, I guess you're close to your 20th anniversary at the Congressional Research Service. So I don't know if they give you a gold watch or what a pin. Well, that's wonderful, congratulations. Nicole is certainly an expert on a whole host of water resources issues and climate resilience, but certainly the Army Corps of Engineers is a particular area that she specializes in. News to me was Nicole was an independent consultant and professor in Mexico City, which I found very interesting and want to talk to you about at a different date. She earned her PhD in civil environmental engineering at the University of Texas in Austin. And then she also had an opportunity in 2011 to serve as a Fulbright Senior Scholar at the Australian National University, studying water use and water market participation by Australia's energy sector. So that kind of drew me in to want to ask you something about the energy-water nexus, even though you may have transitioned out of that. So I'm bringing you back to that field of expertise. With that, I will then turn to briefly introduce Nathan, and then I'll kick it over to Nicole after that to share some opening remarks. Nate Allen is the Executive Director for WaterStart. Nate will no doubt do a better job of describing WaterStart than I, but they're a wonderful partner of the Reservoir Center who really focuses on innovation in the water space, which is particularly relevant to what we're talking about today. Nate brings a fascinating range of experiences to his role, including serving as a former director of the Steamboat Canal and Irrigation Company in Reno, Nevada. That's certainly caught my eye as a guy who used to work with the Bureau of Reclamation. I'm certainly familiar with those types of enterprises. He also is founder and principal at TerraSwell, an environmental services company that uses a suite of ground-based aerial and remote sensing technologies to provide diagnostics and planning services to land and infrastructure clients to better manage for changes in the weather. So another topic that makes him particularly relevant to today's conversation. So with that brief introduction, or I hope to be a brief introduction, I'll turn it over to Nicole for any opening remarks.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Is it on? I do work for the Congressional Research Service, but my views today are mine. I am not representing CRS. CRS is nonpartisan and doesn't take positions. So what you're going to hear is a couple points that I thought of when Josh said the canary in the coal mine for the water sector. And having been serving Congress for 20 years, that means I was around during Hurricane Katrina. That means I was around for Hurricane Maria, for Harvey. So one of the things that I would say for everybody thinking about long-term solutions, technologies, is thinking about those interdependencies. And I think some of these disasters really bring those interdependencies home. We see the connection between the water sector, the electricity sector, the telecommunications, transportation. Basically, at the end of the day, once one thing starts failing, we kind of have this cascading effect. And thank you, Sally, for all the comments at the beginning, because it's not just internationally. Those are all US examples, right? But there are, I think one of the things is we have these experiences, identify the lessons, learn from them, trying to implement them. One of the other things I noted about Sally's opening remarks was her first slide. And I was sitting there thinking, that's like each of her little points. I'm like, that's one agency. That's a different federal agency. That's a state responsibility. And so that interdependency is also a challenge for actually facing it and confronting it and making those decisions, making those investments so that the people have the money. Maybe this federal agency has for this and this federal agency has for that. How do you get them to actually communicate on that and make those investments sort of together logically so that it is a system rather than separate systems that may fail as a result of not working together. So the first is don't miss the interdependencies. The second is actually interesting because Sally, who was mentioning this in the international realm, is the water sector is so diverse. There's so many different utilities, so many different stakeholders, levee districts, irrigation districts, dam owners, all the different municipal water utilities. And the question there is, for me, is how are these diverse different interests getting informed? Who are they going to? Who are they asking? What tools and information are they using? And I'm not talking about the ones that are like the stars that are the leaders, but we have a lot of disadvantaged communities that with these systems that are also underinvested in, that have these challenges, that are flooding, and actually a lot of them in floodplains, a lot of them in coastal areas that are particularly vulnerable for flooding. And how are they getting the information to be able to make those investments wisely? And so the third item that I thought of when you said the canary in the coal mine is the responsibility the water sector has as a result of being that canary is avoiding maladaptations, right? Not just thinking along one line or another line, but really making sure that when you're making those investments that you're thinking about how will this age, how will this work in the long run? How is this going to financially affect the communities? What happens if something fails? And how do you make sure that it doesn't fail, but not yet at the same time be something that the community is actually going to accept and actually invest in and continue to maintain? So those are my three thoughts: is don't miss interdependencies, sort of questioning how are a lot of these different groups actually making these decisions, and then finally avoiding those maladaptations.
Cool. I'm going to now turn it over to Nate, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about WaterStart, and as well as your background, and feel free to share some opening remarks as well.
Sure. Thanks, Josh. Really nice to be here this morning. Thanks to Xylem for the invitation to come out and join the meeting today. WaterStart. We are we're a very small association that's dedicated to innovation. So as an innovation association, we try to act as a channel to both direct and accelerate the adoption and deployment of water technologies. Our members are primarily made up of water agencies. So we started out in Nevada, and our members serve water to about 80% of the state's population between Las Vegas and Reno. We've since grown into Arizona and California. We have members in Australia as well as the United Kingdom. All in all, our utility agency members deliver water to about 33 million people. We also work with large consumers in agriculture, in mining. McDonald's actually is our newest member. Organizations that have a vested interest, not just in, kind of the cause of water, but like day in, day out, their operation is water. Those are folks who are members of our association and that we support. Innovation. Why? Why innovation? When I first started this job, setting up a new non-for-profit focused on water in Las Vegas, I got asked by the host of a national call-in radio show, what's the point with things as serious as they are in the Western United States? Can you really innovate your way out of this? That is a difficult answer. And many of you probably are here focused on policy issues around water, being in DC. And I would put this to you, that as a freshman senator, Harry Reid started in the late 80s working to redistribute water rights on the Truckee River, which is the river that runs from Lake Tahoe to Pyramid Lake on the Pyramid Paiute Reservation. That watershed has less than 1 million people on it, 2 states, 2 tribes. Pretty much it. Pretty simple. The last agreement was settled to redistribute rights on the Truckee River in 2017, the year before he stepped down from being a senator. Harry Reid, one of the most, one of the longest serving senators in the United States history, one of the most influential and powerful political operators. It took him 30 years to reallocate rights to water on a pretty small watershed. And the last few weeks, headlines have sped up with what drought looks like in the Colorado that serves, was it 40 million people now? Something like that. 7 states are part of the rights system to the river, but 13 states receive water from it. It is complicated to think that federal intervention on that river is a feasible solution for the water situation in the Western United States. So I would argue, is innovation viable? It is our only option. It is our only option based on how urgent the response is that is needed to figure out how to manage water in the Western United States. And with that, I would just point out something, Josh, the title of this opening segment, The Canary in the Coal Mine, it's really important, right? It's like, in terms of climate change, water is going to be the area where people first feel it, right? So this idea that a miner takes a little bird down into the shaft, and when it dies, because it runs out of oxygen, that's the signal to leave, right? So in that part of the analogy, it's true, right? And that's the thing, all analogies are true and are also false, right? The part where the analogy is problematic is that we cannot react quickly. We cannot exit once we feel the water problems, right? Because of the legal structures that I just told that story about, right, where I live, but also because of the vested costs, the time it takes to build infrastructure and manage water. So it is a challenging situation where the first signal, yes, is going to be coming from water, but that is not the time to start responding to what is ahead of us, right? So, Sally did such a good job of articulating all the kind of challenges, you know what I mean, that are out in front of us. And I think we're at that point now where we have now heard it, right? And if we refuse to take action and make decisions based on it, we are literally building our houses on sand, right? Literally building our houses on sand. I mean, and it is challenging as people, we think about now, not down the road. Even our friends here at Xylem, right? As progressive, forward thinking as they are, we're right here on the waterfront in a high climate risk place for our new corporate headquarters, right? And this is just everybody, we're all in this situation. And so that is really where WaterStart tries to come to the table to try and channel and accelerate the adoption of these new technologies so that we could respond quicker to the challenges that we have ahead of us. Hope that wasn't too dramatic. Sorry, Josh.
Perfectly fitting, perfectly fitting. Thank you for that, Nate and Nicole, absolutely. I'm gonna start a Q&A period. I'll get started with a couple questions for Nate and Nicole, but I certainly want to encourage the audience to jump in at any point if you have questions about whether it's specific to WaterStart or Nicole's work at CRS or on topic. Feel free to raise your hand, but I'll get it started and we'll go from there. Nicole, you mentioned in your opening remarks that there's a fair amount of uncertainty in the water sector as far as how investments are being made with an eye towards climate forecasts, climate resiliency. With your work with Congress and federal agencies and understanding of the federal government, can you talk a little bit about the role of the federal government in working with water users, water operators, working with the Steamboat Canal and Irrigation Company to understand and advise how they should be making decisions when it comes to climate resilience? What role does the federal government have in that? Are they doing a good job? Can they do better? Maybe that's not a CRS question, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think one of the things to start with is actually who's responsible for water in the United States. And that kind of depends on which part of the water system you're talking about. But if you were to say, look at the suite of how the federal government is helping or could help or scale up help, would be going from preparedness to projects, where one of the things the federal government provides is data and information. Some of that data and information is old. Some of that data and information is they're still trying to figure out how to consider climate change. I was actually speaking with Shirley, I think this morning, about Atlas 14, which is like the data that we use for precipitation extremes, often for designing culverts and other kinds of stormwater systems, say. And her data, I think, in her community is 14 years old. And we actually just got through finishing in the US, trying to update that data. But the models that are used are essentially 50 years old. So with some of the recent infrastructure funds, NOAA is trying to figure out and asking the National Academy of Science, well, how do we consider climate in the future so that it's not so deterministic based on the past? So I'd say the data, some of the data is there, some of the data is not there yet. But one of the areas where the federal government can help is providing that information and that data and the science behind it. Other areas would be areas such as planning and support for planning. A lot of the water rights responsibilities in the United States, or the water rights, are actually held at the state. You have different kinds of state water laws across the United States. So often how the federal government can assist is providing support for state planning activities. We've seen an uptick in that with drought planning assistance, both from the last drought and then now some with this drought and some recent investments. You see incentives for different kinds of technology adoptions, reuse, some desal. And you also see different kinds of projects. And I'd say this is also where you're starting to have to be careful on that maladaptation, which is we have some systems that have been in place for a long time for how we develop federal projects and federal assistance for non-federal projects. And I'd say there's efforts to try to integrate some of the science information, but how it affects actual decisions on projects, what features are actually adopted. There have been some efforts to amend how those processes, those decision-making processes internal to agencies are working. We've seen some change. We've not necessarily seen like full-blown change. And I think you're seeing some tensions between communities and some federal agencies about how they see their future in a changing climate as a result.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to move on to Nate and ask you to talk a little bit about WaterStart's goal of deploying innovation to 100 million people. Ambitious goal that it sounds like you're making progress towards, given that WaterStart is a hub of innovation in its own right. So I guess I have a two-part question. First being, can you talk a little bit about the types of innovations that you're seeing that are keeping you on a path towards that goal and that your utility and your memberships are adopting? What are things that are hot right now? What are the types of innovations that are really paying dividends? And the second part of the question that kind of goes to the theme of the day, or what are the barriers you're seeing that's keeping you towards meeting that goal on a either sooner time frame, or what are the things that we all should think about to unlock innovation in the water sector when it comes to climate resilience?
Thanks, Josh. So a couple examples of solutions and a couple examples of barriers that are faced. So solutions, what we really spend a lot of time working on at WaterStart with our members is basically the digitization of infrastructure, right? It's how and where can you put sensors that will give you data in order to make better investments and better decisions. We've put an extraordinary amount of time and effort into making basic measurements. A pilot that we're getting ready to start with Metropolitan Water District of Southern California is on a new German technology that uses lasers to measure the flow of large diameter pipes. So for those of you who don't know Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, they manage all the water rights off the Colorado River. They also manage all the water rights from the State Water Project that takes water from the Oroville Dam, which made headlines a couple years ago when it was overflowing, but is now at like, 30% capacity. So the major water infrastructure in the state is delivered wholesale by Metropolitan Water District. About 19 million people are in their service territory. The only option that they currently have to meter the flow of that water that they deliver to their member agencies is with a meter that is about the size of this room and has to be calibrated. Well, it's an extraordinarily difficult process to calibrate it. So bottom line measurements of like how much water is really being delivered to Hollywood versus San Diego versus, Anaheim, it's complicated. So for us, finding technologies where we can install a small laser, in a tapped pipe that can increase the accuracy of how much water is flowing where, that it helps them to make extraordinarily better decisions with how they're managing the resource. So that's an example of we've done a lot of work around leak detection in drinking water. This is a super, super basic and important kind of activity where nationally, I believe the average is 20% of the water that is cleaned in a drinking water facility lost or unaccounted for by the time it gets to the meter at a house or a building. 20%. Internationally, the average is between 50 and 60%. Our members are down in the 5% or less because of the investments that we have played a small part in helping them with in reducing how much water disappears. And that both, obviously extends the resource, but it helps them have more money in the bank, right? Which helps them become more solvent financially and more resilient. Another one that I think is extraordinarily important is getting into analytics. I mean, I gave you two examples of like some basic data is needed in the water sector before you can get to doing advanced analytics. But we have what I think is an extraordinarily unique and exciting project going on now in Las Vegas, where they are automating their demand management program, where they can take what they've had for a long time as a hydraulic model, where it plans out and forecasts exactly how much water is going to come from which treatment plants, go through what pipes to which consumers throughout the network. Forecasting that is extraordinarily useful in programming all of your operations, right? You can become way more efficient and reliable by doing that. Again, that's better for the ratepayers and the finances, right, of the utility. In the past, that system in Las Vegas, an engineer goes in the morning, they take the data from the day before and they put it into the program. and then they go home. The next day they come back, they run the model, right? They get results out of it, and then they go home. The next morning they come back and they take that forecast from 2 days ago and they enter it into the operations system, which then the next day when the operator comes in, they push start, right? So there's like a 4-day delay. And when you go in Las Vegas from 70 degrees on Tuesday to 110 degrees on Friday, your water forecast is not correct, right? So we have now, in working with Xylem, deployed a technology that will take all of those steps and try to automate them together in order to come up with a more real-time, a more accurate and reliable way to forecast and model what demand will look like in order to better optimize the infrastructure. It's an extraordinary new project, and it represents probably like 1% of the utilities and where they're at. But that is where we're going, right? And I think that kind of reliability and opportunity to improve how the system's managed has extraordinary potential. So that was technologies. I probably went on too long. Sorry, Josh. Barriers to deploying these technologies, it really depends on what kind of entity you are. But even at an entity like Metropolitan Water Districts of Southern California, I think they have a $2.5 billion annual capital improvement budget. If any employee inside of that organization wants to fund a project that costs more than $100,000, they must go to their board for approval. Their board is nominated by elected officials. It is like a training ground for politicians. This is not the place to go to teach somebody about why you need meters that use lasers, right? So this is where WaterStart comes in. We use our not-for-profit status to go out and raise charitable funds from other sources, state grants, philanthropic grants, corporate funds, from organizations that have a vested interest in seeing more innovation happen, right? And to see the water industry become more resilient. We take those grant funds and we enable our members to try new things, right? So they want to install lasers on a big water pipe, but it costs $125,000 to put in one. They cannot go to their board and say, we want to try this one thing and it maybe will work. That will not happen. So what we say is, we have $50,000 in grant funds. Let's try this. Let's see how it happens. And when you know it works, when you know what the ROI is, then go to the board and ask for all the funds, put it into the capital improvement budget, right? Which takes like a 2-3 year process to do it, but that's the process. So that big barrier that is around public procurement, which is really there for important reasons to protect ratepayers from fraud, right? That we've seen in places around lead pipes. And those procurement rules are super, super important, but they are a challenging barrier. And that is one of the main barriers that, as a non-for-profit, we try and help our members navigate those challenges so they can prove something out, that it works, to understand what the ROI is before they make a bigger investment. So that'd be my example I gave of barriers.
Excellent, Nate. Thank you so much for all of that. At this point, I would love to open up the floor for any questions in the audience. I have more, so no pressure, but I would love to hear from you. So if anyone has a question for our panelists, feel free to raise your hand. I'll just walk out and hand you the microphone and allow you to introduce yourself, your organization, and ask any questions you would like. If not, I'll keep going. So any questions? Got one. I'm going to hand this over to you.
Ahmed Osman. I'm with Black & Veatch, an engineering consulting company. Nicole, I was intrigued by your experience with the Corps of Engineers. Specifically, I was interested in the planning framework, the criteria being used to fund projects in flood protection, for example. Are those being updated? In some instances, we find, being reliant on the historical data, historical records, it's sometimes difficult to justify, future conditions, increasing frequency of these extreme events. And so there is, we see a need for using future data, future climate models, what they're telling us, but also looking at multiple objectives, not just one objective to justify investment. Is there movement in that area that you can speak to? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ahmet. The question of core planning criteria, what are the guidelines, what are the economic models, what are the technical information that they use, is something that Congress has tried to address in the last few years, particularly in the Water Resources Development Act of 2020, which was enacted in December of 2020. And so they are in the process of addressing some of those topics. The Corps has been working for a number of years to figure out how to better integrate climate change information into its projects. It has long included sea level rise estimates, but for a long time they were quite low. And starting, I don't know, 2012, 2013, they started using more, I'd say, advanced curves, but often those curves were still below, say, what NOAA was predicting. And they have updated those multiple times. Congress recently did say, hey, take another look at, for example, your sea level rise curves. Inland flooding has been, I'd say, a little harder for the Corps to figure out where to go. Congress also told them to relook at their inland flooding estimates. And I guess we'll wait and we'll see what's happening there. Another area that Congress actually told them many years ago, and then Congress told them not to for many years, and now it's told them, please go ahead and do that, is re-looking at how they do their economic analysis and their decision making. Historically, the Corps was actually one of the really early adopters of cost benefit analysis, but sort of exactly what's included in those analyses and how you consider, for example, disadvantaged communities, it is a topic, I would say, that they're continuing to try to address. And at the end of the previous administration, the Trump administration, they did put out some guidance indicating that there was interest in using more social variables as well as some environmental. The actual detailed guidance on that has not yet been released, but we keep hearing that it's coming. So I'd say probably by the end of the year, you are likely to see something. And that's also because Congress has asked them to do it. Does that help? And Nathan, I'll be curious what you think of the example I provide. I think one really interesting example is drought.gov, which is one of the public-facing products of the NIDIS, and I'm not going to remember what the acronym all stands for, National Drought Information System. There's a couple other letters in there. But basically, it is NOAA leading an effort, but really it has a whole bunch of other federal agencies that participate, as well as stakeholders, as academics, that try to provide a product that's pretty understandable, a visual graphic of this is where drought is. Right now it's very red out west. But this is where drought is. This is where we expect it to go in the next few months. And then provides historical data so you can see how the different categories of drought have varied over, say, the last 20 years. So I'd say it's a very helpful product for people to understand. One of the other things I think that has happened as a result of some of that collaboration is when you have a drought, these scientists are sometimes coming together and putting out reports about what have we learned from this drought. And they recently did a report they did two reports. They recently did a report about what types of information would be more helpful for being able to understand drought in the future. So not just sort of more seasonal, better information for subseasonal forecasting, but also how do we understand how the oceans interplay with other phenomena in order to affect drought probabilities in the Southwest. I think one of the real challenges for drought is you have both dry, wet, because more water in the atmosphere, but then, I mean, hot and wet, but you also have hot and dry. And sometimes the models it's hard to see how it's all going to work out. And I think that's another area where it's really interesting then that's kind of where the attribution science is coming in. That's still pretty, some of it's pretty nascent, I'd say, but it's an interest, I'd say for drought, it's a particularly interesting area to watch. And I think the collaboration between between the feds, lots of different researchers and lots of different agencies, and then trying to learn with each drought is, for me, a good example.
I can quickly get in over my head on this topic because this is not where I live professionally, but I guess the couple of things that I'd say about models like what's on drought.gov is, first of all, it's an extraordinarily useful tool to have a site like that where you can go. I think where our members and companies in our portfolio struggle with it at times is that they want to go on and use it as lay people. And we have, for example, like development associations come to us and want to look at that. And there are some very big gaps in gaps between what that website for and what that website is for. So as an example, at least in terms of where you're labeling drought, on the big map of the West that's all red right now, for the most part, that does not factor what reservoir levels look like. And if you are a business that has invested in, manufacturing or is looking to do that, you have no way to make a distinction between, say, Las Vegas and Los Angeles, or Reno and Salt Lake City. You don't, and the water availability for you to make long-term business decisions on is not based off of the drought designation, because the drought model often just looks at like how much precipitation is there, how much water is in the ground. You know what I mean? It's kind of a surface image, right, of drought. It's not looking at what is water availability into the future, right? That is not what that tool is, and it is often used that way. So I think there is a challenge, just from a very lay, practical kind of perspective about that tool to communicate what it really is. Hope that's fair.
And I think it's kind of gets to something that was in Sally's slide, where one of the things you had was high heat. And a lot of the drought.gov was originally developed and used first in terms of U.S. Department of Agriculture designations for getting different kinds of federal assistance for crops, livestock, and so forth. And so as a tool for managers, it's not the best tool. And I think that's where trying to understand the whole sector and and all the different users and understand what kind of information they need.
Yeah, and then you get into public lands management. You know, we have a lot of conflict where we are about ranchers who are closed out of their grazing rights because BLM has made a agency-wide decision based on the drought monitor, even though in some watersheds, there's plenty of grass and there was plenty of rain in those specific little spots. So it is a super important tool. The challenge is understanding what it's really for, you know, and who can use it for which kind of information.
Well, as they would say in my former life, reclaiming my time, I want to ask another question, moderator's prerogative, as it were. I guess I'll start with Nate and then shift to Nicole after that. The most recent bipartisan infrastructure law really emphasized ensuring that underserved communities, rural communities were in a position to unlock infrastructure funding in a way that perhaps historically they hadn't utilized. Linking that to innovation and climate resilience, Nate, I know a lot of your membership, like Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, have resources if you're able to navigate through the procurement process to look into innovation and pilot programs and ultimately invest. Given the emphasis that Congress placed in distributing funding to small, disadvantaged rural communities, coupled with the administration's Justice 40 initiative, I'm wondering how, what you're seeing and how we can ensure collectively that communities, underserved communities, rural communities that perhaps are a little bit further down the socioeconomic ladder, they're able to utilize innovation. They're able to utilize some of these cutting edge technologies so that we're not leaving large swaths of our, the globe behind, given their inability to invest. So maybe I'll start off with you, Nate, and Nicole, if you have any comments on the back end.
Sure, thanks, Josh. I think two kind of points that I'd make. One is, the investments for water are mostly going into the state revolving loan funds. That's where by far the biggest chunk of funding is going to, and that makes sense because that program has been around a long time and serves everybody. So that's good. One of the challenges with the state revolving loan funds is there's kind of an ecosystem built around how those things work. And one of the challenges that we're trying to figure out how to support is that I think it goes back to 2010. Al, you might know better than me. Back in 2010, during the Obama administration, they expanded what kinds of projects could be financed by state revolving loan funds. And just in drinking water, as an example, it expanded it to allow you to do leak detection, smart meters, energy efficiency. I think water recycling was in there on the wastewater side. But at least as of 2018, not a single SRF in the United States had financed any project related to those things. So that is a challenge, that as SRFs, like in Nevada, the money that was allocated last year for the infrastructure bill, the amount of money that will go to Nevada is worth more than the Nevada has ever received since the fund was set up 30 some years ago, right? So it's an extraordinary amount of funds that can have a really significant impact. Our interest, one of the things that I'm actually also working on while I'm out here today is talking to folks about how to make sure those kind of smart meters and new technologies can be leveraged by communities to deploy those solutions, because they're really important, especially for small water systems. The second thing, which I'll just raise and preface that I am woefully undereducated in this area around equity, is when you look then within the big urban water systems and you talk about things like direct potable reuse or desalination, which are that is the future of water resources, right? Or those two areas. Those types of systems will be deployed in lower socioeconomic areas of the urban infrastructure because they will be built on top of existing water treatment plants, right? And for those of you, you know, Sally had that great cartoon up here about the water cycle, you know, down in the bottom left where it was like, was it like informal development or something like that? That's where wastewater treatment plants are built today, now. And so those will be retrofitted to do water recycling. And the people that will get the highest percentage of recycled water are the folks that live down there in the informally developed river bottoms. And is that equitable for those folks to be asked to drink wastewater where folks living further up on the hill are drinking fresh snow melt? I don't know. And I don't think it'll be perceived that way. And I think that there is a serious challenge in equity because that water will be lower quality than what is coming out of the reservoir up in the mountains. It will be. It'll be safe, but it will be lower quality. And it's something that I don't know how that is going to be addressed. But it's something that needs to be raised in the community and talked about.
So Josh, you started with the bipartisan infrastructure law. I don't cover EPA appropriations. I should probably read my colleagues' reports on EPA appropriations. So I'm not as familiar with how much of that was like designated for disadvantaged, low income, or communities, or how much went to USDA's rural programs either. What I can speak to is the Army Corps of Engineers. It got about $17 billion in that program. And partly because of the way the Corps' projects are developed and get authorized by Congress. And there's not like a specific like set of funds or programs. There are now a few authorities for disadvantaged communities. Part of Ahmet's earlier question of how are they changing how they develop those projects, that's kind of how you get to trying to change maybe how you are addressing lower income and disadvantaged communities. So actually, I think there was 30 million set aside specifically for a new program that Congress authorized in December 2020 for pilot programs for rural and disadvantaged communities. The administration recently came out with its implementation guidance, which indicates that they're going to try to address more of the disadvantaged communities and rural issues through its implementation guidance. So not so much in the law, but in how the administration is going to identify which activities you get the money. That is where you're probably going to see more of it. The other thing that happened with the Water Resources Development Act of 2020 was that I think it was in there, where Congress told them to, when they created it may have been even in 2018 a little bit, when you create they created these new disadvantaged authorities, and this money from the infrastructure bill will be the first time those authorities get funded, come up with a definition. For a long time, I think 1986, there had been a definition of if you're a disadvantaged community, you can get the cost share lowered, but it was implemented in such a way that 2 projects qualified since like 1986. So right now in the Federal Register, there is an opportunity for public comment on how the Corps identifies disadvantaged communities. And that potentially may be along with the changes to how they develop their projects, maybe one of the bigger changes that comes out of the last few bills and the direction of where is the agency spending its money in the long run. One thing to note on the other thing that happened with the bipartisan infrastructure law was that they also included money for what's called the Corps WIFIA program. So In addition to SRFs, the Congress created these loan and loan guarantee programs, and that's where you've potentially seen some more of those innovative activities happening. And now they're standing that up for dam safety projects at the Corps, also open in the Federal Register right now as comments on on how the Corps' criteria for which dam safety projects to include, and they have a lot of water supply augmentation type of and water quality type of criteria that are included in that draft.
Hello. We are at time. I wanted to thank Nate and Nicole for their wonderful presentations and handling those questions. Really thoughtful discussion. Really appreciate you both participating.